Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this month's Cyber Threat Briefing. I'm joined by the ever-present Hugh Raynor. My name is Nick Hayes, and we're going to take you through four kind of topics that we've picked up throughout the last month or so that have kind of flashed up and feel worthy of a conversation within the cyber security space. Before we get started, though, Hugh, how's things? Are you doing all right?
Yeah, absolutely. Glad to be joined by you.
Excellent, good. Right, so let's, as long as you're doing good, let's kick on here and let's get on with it. So this month's discussion points, we've got a password stealing and impersonation risks. These have been discovered recently in the Okta provider. They've also been disputed by Okta. So we'll just mention that up front there ahead of time. We'll just get into a little bit about them and what that means. We've got managing malware on Unix-based operating systems. So there's a new strain of malware around that is targeting non-Windows-based operating systems now. So a little bit of advice around what to look for and what to do. We're going to talk a little bit more about time to weaponization as well. So now that these days vulnerabilities are exploited faster than ever before, we've got some stats around that as well. We can share some insights around that. And then the final point is how to achieve your goals with fewer resources as cybersecurity costs increase. So as we well know, we're in the middle of a cost of living crisis, well on the way to one anyway. And everything seems pressured at the minute. So it felt like the right time to talk about, the challenges that we're seeing in the marketplace, the challenges that, if we're seeing it, everybody else will be seeing it, and how you can achieve more with less ultimately. So without further ado, shall we get into it, Hugh?
Yeah, absolutely.
Good. Okay, so on the first point then, so password stealing and impersonation risk disputed by an identity provider Okta. Okay, so that's number one on the list here. And just a bit of a brief background to everyone before we dive into it. There has been some research done and released this week by a company called Authomize, who have kind of looked at Okta in depth. So they're kind of, I guess, go-to-market strategies around identity providers and shoring up that, looking at security of identity providers, etc. They've looked at Okta in particular, and they believe they've uncovered some high impact inherent security risk in the way that Okta is put together and operates. So the issues that they found and I've talked about in their blog post include clear text password extraction via SCIM, which is a protocol for, sharing passwords between identity providers. Number two is sharing of passwords and sensitive data over unencrypted channels. A hub and spoke configuration, which allows admins to compromise accounts in the hub or other spokes downstream. And mutable identity log spoofing is the fourth one. So Hugh, I don't know how you want to approach these. Do you want to approach them one by one, or do you want to just talk about them in general overall?
Yeah, so the first one, I suppose, is probably the one that strikes me as most concerning. Again, with all of these items, Okta themselves are saying they're not security issues. They are intended, quirks of intended functionality, and there is for every one of these issues, configuration setting or remediation action that you can take. But the way that these guys have been able to prove stealing plain text credentials from Okta is as you say, they're setting up a SCIM server, which, yeah, exactly as you said, used for transferring credentials and identities, typically between SaaS, software as a service applications. And then in the Okta management console, so you would need a set of admin credentials to do this, but then you can redirect where Okta looks to sync those credentials with. And by setting it as the SCIM server, which the attacker can set up over HTTP as well, not HTTPS, you can actually force that redirection, that resynchronization with that SCIM server, and that will just provide you with the entire list of all credentials and identities managed within that organization. So Okta say that's not an issue, but it seems quite concerning that it seems so easy to obtain all of that plain text credential matter. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, it goes without saying that they have disputed the kind of claims, but it looks like they're having a good dialogue with Authomize anyway in terms of kind of way forward and working these things out. So I'm not here to comment on whether it is an issue or not an issue, or vulnerability, not a vulnerability, but it's obviously worthy of raising this to people listening in. My view is that as a default configuration, it doesn't seem a great thing to have in place. And I'm aware that there are things that you can do to mitigate it. So the settings that you can put in place to mitigate the issues, particularly of the top two. But it also seems to me that there are elements to this attack chain that requires some elements of social engineering as well. So it's not just a case of fire it at an Okta provider or an Okta environment and you'll get some success. It feels like you do also need some interaction with someone on the inside who has the right level of permissions as well. Is that correct? Am I correct?
Yeah, exactly. So none of these things are what I'd necessarily class as vulnerabilities, because there's no exploit for these, right? Most of them, well, in fact, all of them, you're requiring some access to the Okta sort of console to be able to work with. And I think it probably comes down to the fact that when people are looking to implement these, identity provider solutions, what Okta really don't want is for you to implement that system and for it to not work and to cause issues in your environment. So the default options are sort of, by virtue of that, quite permissive and will allow things to occur just so that the system works. And then, yeah, you really do then have to go in and make sure that you harden that yourself and modify that configuration to suit your environment. Otherwise, you end up with situations like this.
Excellent. Yeah, and it does mention as well, it's not necessarily a high level admin that you need. It's an app admin, right? So it's the lowest level built-in account that can assign access to an app ultimately.
Yeah, indeed.
Good. So Hugh, what's the recommendations here? What do we, if people are using Okta now, what are the next steps that they should do?
Yeah, so basically just go through around the blog post. You can see basically the areas that are affected. So things like username duplication is one of the settings, and that's the one that affects like that the non-repudiation case in the logs, and spoofing as another user. So go out and disable that. Look through your configuration settings carefully and actually decide, do I need this level of permission to suit my organizational requirement? And if you can tighten up those settings, yeah, absolutely, you should do so. Don't just assume that out of the box everything's going to work perfectly for you.
Thank you. Anything else you want to add on to that particular attack chain path against Okta? Otherwise, I do have a question about identity providers. Yeah, okay, good. So I guess the question I would have as well that may well be a good discussion point is around identity providers in general. So it feels like to me that these are massively critical parts of an infrastructure these days, and the way that a company would operate their IT infrastructure particularly. What can I do? It's clearly quite important. So how do I make sure that I've, for whatever identity provider, whether it's Okta or something else, how do I make sure I've provisioned that in the right way? It's configured in a secure manner. What are the options for me there? Yeah,
well, I guess the first question to cover there is, should I be using an identity provider? And yeah, we do occasionally get things like this come up in these massive global identity providers, but I guarantee that if you tried to implement that yourself in-house, you'd probably come across a far greater number of issues a lot sooner. So this is by no way saying that identity providers are a bad idea, and they do make a lot of that really difficult and critical work around managing these identities a lot easier for you. But yeah, absolutely. Compare the different offerings available and take the time to assess business requirements, testing them as well. Get people in to test that configuration. Work with your vendor on looking for guidance on how best to tailor that to suit your environment.
Brilliant, thank you. So I'll post the Authomize blog in the chat as well. It's good, it's a pretty good, well-written blog in my view. Has quite a lot of steps to replicate in there as well as mitigation advice, etc. as well. So I'll post that in there. If you're using Okta, it would be wise to have a read through it. Again, proviso, and so this is kind of contested, I guess, is one way of putting it at the minute. Cool, we'll move on in that case. So Hugh, next one on the list was managing malware on Unix-based operating systems. So one of the key news items from a couple of weeks ago now was around a new malware strain, new ransomware strain actually called Red Alert, which was not just targeting Windows hosts as ransomware typically would, but appeared to be targeting ESXi hosts as well. Have you got any thoughts on how you might manage and mitigate malware attacking non-Windows hosts? It's typically, a less known area of an infrastructure, less kind of monitored and less logged area of an infrastructure. So have you got any advice there?
Indeed, when most of the time we think about malware, we're thinking about Windows-based malware strains and things like that. But absolutely, it's definitely important that we consider Linux as well. I mean, there are actually quite a few different solutions you can look at. I think most distributions of Linux contain ClamAV by default, which is, it is a really good bit of tooling. It's open source. Everyone can contribute signatures to that. It does work well, but it's not the easiest to use. Again, like we were just talking about, out of the box, maybe not the most user-friendly option. So there are then, the commercial offerings from, the common vendors that we see on Windows as well, like Sophos and the rest, that are, they're going to be more easy to use, and are going to probably integrate better with your tooling on the Windows estate as well. But ClamAV is free, and it does do a really good job of finding things. So I guess beyond that, beyond just looking at the anti-malware, is also making sure that our Linux hosts are, if we're using a SIEM or a SOC, that we're ingesting data from those hosts as well, and are taking just the same precautions. Because I mean, from experience, right? When you're first learning, pen testing or hacking or whatever you want to call it, it's primarily Linux hosts you're working with. So most of the training labs and things like that are Linux based. So absolutely, attackers will be really familiar with Linux, well versed, hundreds of exploits available, and a lot of the tool is natively sort of Linux based as well. So absolutely, if you do have Linux hosts in your network, they are going to be a target because they're a great foothold for an attacker to get.
Yeah, particularly SXI ones as well, which are hosting generally other servers as well. So if you get that kind of hypervisor layer, then you're into a good, well, I say in a good spot. If you're an attacker, you're into a good spot. If you're defending it, not a great spot. Are there any other controls you could put in place? How about things like network segregation, that kind of thing? Should you put your admin interfaces onto a separate network, for instance?
Yeah, I mean that's an obvious one, right? And we were talking a lot, quite regularly, about using VLANs and management networks and things like that to try and lock things down. But certainly, I've not really seen too much of a shift in my testing away from flat networks. Really, I think they're easy to manage. They work. People just sort of gravitate towards that from an ease of use perspective. But absolutely, if you do have particularly high value assets, segment that network to make sure that they've got those extra controls and working towards that defense in depth model.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and they're good resources as well, aren't there? There's the 10 steps from NCSC, which covers some ransomware piece in there, and I think there's a ransomware framework from NIST as well, which is based off the CSF. Again, really good resources if you are looking to assess yourself against controls, generally speaking, that are related to ransomware. Good.
Absolutely.
Excellent. We'll move on. Very related, actually, the third point to what we just talked about, which is time to weaponization. So the indicators are that vulnerabilities these days are being exploited faster than ever before. And I guess my question to you, Hugh, is what's the implication of that? So what are we dealing with here?
Yeah, so I guess it really makes things quite difficult for us, because we're always talking about effective patch management programs and maintaining good cyber hygiene. But as we're seeing this time to weaponization, the time between a vulnerability being disclosed and that being weaponized and automated and hooked into ransomware come down, it really makes that more difficult, because you can't just say, right, great, we'll get all of our patching done within 14 days, because we've seen, so I think in 2020, I did some digging on this. In 2020, it seemed like on average, we were seeing that gap between disclosure and weaponization at about 15 days. But now we're seeing it come down to about 5 days. So that's, a third of the time, which is, really is quite scary. And, most organizations are not feasibly going to be able to get every single patch deployed across every host in an environment within those 5 days. So I think calling on things like automation, automated vulnerability scanning, that can run in the background, that's then picked up and verified by an individual, is really going to be ever more important. Getting as much done, in an automated fashion that can run on that constant rolling basis, to make sure that as soon as an issue drops, you get that notification of it, whether that's in your network or calling on open source intelligence and threat intelligence from the wider world as well.
Brilliant. Yeah, thank you. I know that rolls into our next question. So obviously 15 days down into 5 means that everything's a little bit more pressured than it has been previously. And it goes across the board, right? So we're going to talk about the 4th point here, which is how to achieve your goals with fewer resources as cybersecurity costs increase. Now, this can come from the people angle, right? So people, generally the market is a little bit strong right now. It could come from a tooling perspective. There's inflation in place, so tooling pricing is going to go up. I would imagine across the market. And then coupled with that, you've got this ever increasing downward pressure of, we need to do more, we need to do much more quicker, ultimately. So I think we'll have a brief discussion here around how you can achieve more with relevant resources. Now, I can cover off some of the people angle stuff, but Hugh, in the first instance, do you have any kind of thoughts on how customers and organizations out there can achieve more with less, ultimately?
Yeah, I think historically there's been a really strong desire to maintain all those key skills in-house and have everyone in your cybersecurity team that can fill all of these roles and functions and manage that internally. But obviously that is expensive, and for the hopefully 362 days of the year that you don't have an ongoing cyber incident, that cost of those resources still exists, right? So I think we're going to see a trend towards leveraging of managed services, whether that's in detection or response or anywhere really, just so that we're not having to manage and maintain those resources. We're not having to constantly stay on top of maintaining a team of people that are skilled threat analysts and things like that. Just outsourcing that, making use of the sort of combined efforts of organizations that are able to service multiple clients. I mean, we don't all run diesel generators in our house to provide electricity for us, right? We just pay money for the infrastructure and say, hey, National Grid, you handle that energy distribution and we'll just use that resource. So it's a model that works in other areas, right? So I think we're definitely going to see a trend towards reliance on managed services. Not to say that isn't without its own risk.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think you touched on something there, and the example being electricity, right? So generally usage-based as well. I think there's probably quite a lot of managed service providers out there that are not operating on a usage-based system right now. It'll be a case of, we think you need X amount of resource for this long period of time. It'll cost you therefore that times by that. But there's probably an alternative method, an alternative mechanism for commercialization of this. You can maybe look at a usage-based managed service model, for example, and so on and so forth. So there's probably some intelligent pricing that can go off from a vendor perspective here to help with matters as well, I think. I had a few thoughts on this particular point as well, mostly from a people perspective. So I do quite a lot of hiring efforts in the marketplace, hiring for consultants, both penetration testers and risk consultants. No getting away from it. The market is pretty hot right now, which does kind of make the hiring scene a little bit more challenging than probably in other windows of time. But there's certainly things that you can do. I think things like having a good, strong culture would be quite an important thing that someone can come into. I think there's elements, you look at consultants and technical people, they always kind of want to learn something new. So learn off someone, particularly, if they're hiring them, given the opportunity for training, that kind of thing. I think those kind of elements are really strong and can be quite a nice pull. I think anything you can do in terms of a progressive approach to things like employee benefits and employee experience, so things like flexible working, work from home, that kind of stuff, I think again will be very powerful key pulls for various people. But ultimately, it's tough going out there. And if we're finding it tough, and we've got quite a large team, I assume that some end user roles who might have only 2 or 3 people in the team because funds, whatever, is restricting that. That's going to be challenging. So if you have a team of 3 consultants or 3 internal pen testers, and the senior guy leaves because he had a lucrative offer from somewhere else, your 2 junior guys are probably floundering a little bit and struggling in there. So I think it's tough out there right now, but it's even probably more problematic and difficult from an end user perspective as well. So I think the points you made there, Hugh, around a managed service type offering potentially becoming more prevalent is quite key. On the managed service side of things as well, you've got to be pretty comfortable with the managed service provider themselves. So you're going to have to give them, trust them quite a lot. And I think it's paramount that you do pick a good one, more someone that you're comfortable with, can work with well, that can ultimately have feedback given and make the appropriate actions off the back of that feedback as well. So I think some really good insights there. I think the other point as well around fewer resources, and then this is kind of me talking about things that I've seen in the past and we see currently now, is that a lot of people spend money on tooling, and in some cases a lot of tooling, but potentially don't tune that tooling in the right way. So they might just stick an EDR solution in its default form and plug it in there. Great, okay, I've bought this thing, so that must mean I'm fully protected and everything's going to be detected. It's not always the case. And I think there's probably an argument here for spending time to properly tune tooling that you have previously bought into your environment, into your use cases. Make sure it's configured correctly with your kind of alert thresholds and things like that, so that you can be comfortable that it's doing the job that it says it's going to do. That when you do spend people time, which is very valuable, that's spent in the right place and in the right way and in an impactful manner as well. Did you have any thoughts on tooling, tuning, and so on and so forth?
Yeah, I just echoing the importance of, just as if you got a new individual into the organization, you'd spend the time to train them up and make sure that they were operating in the way you'd expect of them. Absolutely, that's the same for EDR, XDR, all of that. It's only going to do what it's set up to do. So there's huge importance in that as well. And as you mentioned you touched on sort of the employee satisfaction sort of pull. I think that's really important as well. And again, automation is absolutely going to help with that, because I think we're seeing the bits that we're able to automate most and that lend themselves most easily towards automation are probably also the parts of people's jobs which they get the least satisfaction out of doing as well. So by providing the automation, you're going to free up a lot of time, specifically for then the resources that you do have to be working on things which are both valuable to you and interesting to them as well.
Yes, spot on that. I think we might be just about out of time, Hugh. I think we've covered a fair bit there, but I will open the chat up now. If anyone's got any questions, feel free to post them in the chat box at the bottom, and we'll have a look at them as they come in. Otherwise, you're more than welcome to contact us outside of that if you do have any other questions. Otherwise, we do thank you for joining us. It's been an absolute pleasure as always, and we'll see you in a month's time. We'll hang around for a couple of minutes and look for any questions coming in.
Thanks, everyone.